Hi students, welcome to the last mini e-lecture in this series on Gateway 2 of Variable Weather and Changing Climate, where we'll be studying what is happening to the Earth's climate. Today we are going to focus on what are the responses to climate change, and the e-lecture objectives are to describe the responses to climate change and evaluate the effectiveness of the responses. So knowing what we know about climate change, what do you think are some responses that we should make? Should we be changing our everyday lives? Should we be making changes to the activities that we take part in? What would you do knowing what you know now about how the Earth's climate has changed? And how would you know if what you have been doing is effective? Now you realize that there is a new command word in our e-lecture objectives, evaluate. To evaluate is to judge and to decide how effective a measure has been based on its results. So as we go on through today's e-lecture, you realize that we'll be looking at the strengths and the limitations of the measures to see how effective each of the responses have been. Now, responses have been made to climate change on the international level and on the national level for many countries. Today, in particular, we're going to study the Kyoto Protocol and the Copenhagen Conference and how these have been enacted to make changes to what we have done to climate. On a national level, we'll be studying what Singapore has done, but we will not be touching India. It will be provided in the slides, but we are not going to talk about it in today's e-lecture. To start off, the Kyoto Protocol. This was an international agreement to reduce the greenhouse gases emission into the atmosphere. It was drawn up in 1997 and came into effect in 2005, and different countries had different targets to hit, and the progress of carbon emissions were tracked and reported for review. This will show you the targets that different countries set. So for example, USA set a target to reduce their emissions by 7%. Okay, so the green areas will also show you some permissions where they are allowed to increase their emissions for a while, but after 2012 they should start to reduce their emissions. Now this Kyoto Protocol was pretty successful in the sense that many countries met or exceeded the targets that they set during the Kyoto Protocol because there was constant monitoring and reporting by countries for self and peer assessment. Now this is like you setting your goals for your exams. Because they set their goals and because they checked each other and they checked themselves, they actually managed to succeed. So if you look at this diagram, it will show you that certain countries like USA, European Union, Russia, Japan, Canada actually managed to reduce their greenhouse gas emission. However, of course, you will see this. We will discuss that in just a while. Now, this Kyoto Protocol also encouraged sustainable development as it paired developed countries to work with developing countries to reduce carbon emissions in their projects. So this was called the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism, and it worked very well for the transmission of technologies which reduce the carbon emissions of countries that were developing. However, not all of the countries were able to meet their goals, and not all countries had the same emission targets. Of course, sometimes when we don't set our targets very high, we don't necessarily do very well. Aim for the stars so you hit the clouds. Some countries like Denmark, Sweden, and United Kingdom did not actually achieve their targets. Also, many countries did not even sign the protocol, and they continued to contribute to global emissions. Some of these emissions came particularly from China, India, and the USA, and as you know, in the past 2 decades, these 3 countries have grown very, very quickly. China's industries have grown so quickly that it's very difficult to keep records. India as well, and the 2 of them are the most populous countries in the world. So when these countries don't sign and they continue to emit carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, what do you think will happen? So if you look at this will show you that certain countries really did very well. However, China and all these other countries, these developing countries, did not sign and they continued to increase their carbon dioxide emissions. What do you think would have been the impact on our global climate? Now, because of the failures of Kyoto Protocol, or should I say the weaknesses, the Copenhagen Conference was drawn up in 2009 to address some of these. So this was held in Denmark in collaboration with the United Nations Climate Change Conference to build upon the measures and to improve further to address climate change. Now, this Copenhagen Conference was successful in the sense that it allowed countries to discuss measures to deal with climate change effectively and to improve on what we did earlier, the CDM, the Clean Development Mechanism. So more transference of technologies to allow developing countries to reduce carbon emissions was done. And there was an international agreement to keep the increase in global temperature to less than 2 degrees Celsius. Pledges were also made, and the developed countries pledged to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 2020 and to provide $30 billion in US dollars for developing countries to fight climate change. Now, as you would know, developing countries have lower levels of technology, and therefore sometimes they find it harder to fight climate change. For the same kind of factory in the developed country and the developing country, they may have different kinds of emissions because of the different filters that are available. So these were the agreements made at the Copenhagen Conference. So until 2012, these countries have pledged to reduce emissions, and some of them have pledged really great amounts. However, the problem with the Copenhagen Conference was that the plans were not very concrete. How were they going to reduce greenhouse gases exactly? There was a lot of discussion, but there were no concrete plans made. And this Copenhagen Accord was not adopted by all countries yet again. It was a guideline, and no countries were binded or punished if they do not fulfill their pledges, unlike the Kyoto Protocol where they had to pay fines, but even then it was very hard to enforce. So we have actually done 2 rounds of evaluation for the Kyoto Protocol and the Copenhagen Conference, and we're going to move on to the national response in terms of Singapore. The first response that we have is the Singapore Green Plan, and the second is the Green Mark Scheme. Now, the Singapore Green Plan is a strategy that was launched by the Ministry of Environment to reduce Singapore's carbon emissions and to, in general, improve Singapore's efforts to improve our environment. So one element that we're going to focus on is the usage of natural gas to make our energy cleaner. So this was successful as by 2010, 79% of Singapore's electricity was being generated from natural gas. However, because natural gas is very complex and because it's difficult to transport, the high maintenance costs cause it to be very difficult to implement fully. Now, the Singapore Green Mark Scheme is a second measure and it has been used to make our buildings more green. So I'm not going to do this in detail. Please read the successes and limitations on your own. But I want you to look at this building. How is the building shown environmentally friendly? And how can it help to reduce carbon dioxide emissions? Take a moment, just write it down in your notebooks. You can pause it here if you want to. Okay, if you look very carefully, you'll realize that there is vegetation all along the sides of the building. So this is the first thing. It is environmentally friendly because the presence of vegetation lowers the temperatures of the building. And this reduces the use of energy for air conditioning, which also reduces the amount of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere. Now, trees provide shade, and because of the trees, the sun rays won't enter the building so quickly and so easily. So this actually lowers the temperatures. And when you have lower temperatures, we don't need so much aircon to keep all the equipment inside cold, and this reduces the amount of energy used. So this is one of the measures that were implemented in the Green Mark Scheme to make buildings more environmentally friendly. Okay, there is one measure that we'll be talking about, the Singapore Plants a Tree program, also known as the Community in Bloom program that is hallmarked by NParks right now. Now, this was started in 1971, and it was a main driver in our measures to become the garden city. As you would know, Singapore has many trees all around, and this is part of it. So residents are encouraged to donate money to buy a tree and take part in tree planting events, politicians and key figures in Singapore society also plant a tree, and they have actually planted 60,000 trees yearly, not just altogether, yearly throughout Singapore. And as a result of all these trees being planted, we have green lungs that remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. However, they do take quite a while to mature, so the positive effects will take time to materialize. And what you see here is that Singapore has actually been planting trees from 1963, and Mr. Lee Kuan Yew was doing that in 1963, and he is still doing it now. So even though the trees take very long to grow, if you think about it in long-term plans, we all hope for Singapore to last for a long time to come, and no matter how long the trees will take to grow, the efforts made to improve the greenness of Singapore will last for generations to come. To recap, the responses to climate change have been happening on an international level and on a national level. Internationally, the Kyoto Protocol and the Copenhagen Conference have all tried to reduce carbon dioxide emissions to certain degrees of success. Singapore has also done so through 3 different plans that we have studied. So what do you think would have been the most effective response to climate change? Who do you think is most important in making the decision to do something about climate change? And I hope you take this time to think about how you can change your own daily practices to respond to climate change. Knowing what we know, should we still be using disposable cutlery as often? What happens when we throw out disposable plates? What happens when we throw out disposable bottles? When these are being processed in the incineration plants, what gases are we releasing into the atmosphere? Are we adding to the greenhouse gases and causing the enhanced greenhouse effect to increase even more? Should we leave it to international and national measures to respond to climate change, or should we be doing something ourselves? I want you to think about this yourself. This may not come out in the exams, or it may, but is it enough to just know what is being done internationally, or should we make our own individual stance to do something about climate change? If you do hope to do something, join me and recycle and make the choice not to dabao all the time. You can come and look for me and discuss on measures that we can use to respond positively to climate change. So I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, even though it's a bit long and it's a bit draggy and there's a lot of content, but I think it's very important for us to really think about how we should respond. We can know all the knowledge we know about climate change, but if we don't make the promise and the effort to do our part, we are never going to be able to combat the problem of climate change. And this is a long-term problem that we'll be leaving for our younger ones. And is this what you want to leave for your children in the future? So I hope I haven't bored you too much. All the best for your study for your common test. Let's do this. Bye!